Welcome to another edition of Dad's Divorce Live. I'm Matt Allen, editor of DadsDivorce.com. Today I'm joined by Denise Hines, who is a research assistant professor at Clark University and whose recent study was the first to link post-traumatic stress disorder to men who seek help after being abused by female partners. Now, men comprise 25 to 50% of all intimate partner violence victims in a given year. And Denise's research study, titled Symptoms of Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder in Men Who Sustain Intimate Partner Violence, was published in the April issue of Psychology of Men and Masculinity. So Denise, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-author on that article, who is Emily Douglas from Bridgewater State University. She and I have worked very closely together on this research.
Okay, great. Now, your research talks about intimate partner violence as well as intimate terrorism. What is the difference between the two, and I guess tell me how intimate partner violence, I guess, gets up to that next level of being deemed terrorism?
Well, intimate partner violence is more of the overarching term. It encompasses various forms of violence between partners, and intimate terrorism is just one of those types. Intimate terrorism is more severe violence that's perpetrated primarily by one partner against the other, and it's embedded in a context of that partner trying to control the other partner. And so within such a relationship, you're also going to see a lot of psychological abuse, also high rates of injury. And we really don't have any established cutoffs of when a relationship begins to get to the point of intimate terrorism.
Okay.
It's basically relative, particularly in comparison to a type of abuse that has been called common couple violence. And in that type of relationship, both partners are about equally violent. The violence tends to be more low frequency, low level. In other words, it's just not as severe. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't tend to be embedded in the context of one partner trying to control the other. So that's more of a function of an argument every once in a while getting out of hand.
Now, you mentioned physical violence as well as psychological abuse. What in your research did you find was more traumatic for men to go through, the physical aspect or the mental aspect?
Well, we actually really don't have a definitive answer for that just yet. So far, our study is the only one that has really looked at this question in men. And in our community sample of men and other community samples of men, it seems to be that the controlling behaviors contribute more to the traumatic symptoms. But on the other hand, in our sample of male victims who sought help for domestic violence victimization, physical violence and controlling behaviors contributed about equally to traumatic symptoms.
Okay. Now, you mentioned how you had one group in your study who had sought help for violence they were experiencing in their relationship, and another group that was sort of just a randomly selected group of men. Now, of the randomly selected group of men, your research said 16% said they had sustained minor acts of violent and psychological abuse from their female partners. Was that surprising to you that here were 520 guys sort of recruited at random and 1 in 6 of them had been victims of abuse?
That number wasn't surprising to us at all. It's actually quite around the percentage that we expected, given the hundreds of population-based, community, and other convenience samples of couples, women, and men that have been conducted in the past 30 years on intimate partner violence. So it's very consistent with previous research on similar samples.
Wow. So that's a consistent result. 1 in 6 men are victims of abuse in female relationships?
Well, it depends on what you define as abuse. We call it victims of some sort of physical violence. So most of that would be things like slapping, grabbing, shoving. Some people would call that abuse, others wouldn't. Yeah. So we use the term just physical violence.
Okay. Now, finally, research shows men are less likely to report incidents of abuse, and police are less likely to arrest female suspects accused of violence than they would male suspects. So in addition to that, I mean, what else is preventing this issue from being as widely recognized as domestic violence against women?
I think that the major contributor is still our insistence on viewing domestic violence as a women's issue.
Yeah.
And a lot of times just using the term violence against women as a synonym for domestic violence. There are many people who are very entrenched in the notion that domestic violence is caused by one and only one thing, which is patriarchy. And these notions really need to be let go of, and we need to begin looking at this issue in a more complex way. We know from about 30 years of research that domestic violence occurs regardless of gender and regardless of sexual orientation. So adhering to the idea that patriarchy is the cause and the only cause of domestic violence only allows for women to be victims and only men to be perpetrators. And so what we're seeing is that domestic violence agencies, they typically don't help men. They aren't prepared to help gays and lesbians, for example. We have data from this same study presented in other articles that shows that men who call domestic violence agencies and hotlines, for the most part, are getting turned away. They're getting laughed at. They're getting told that they must have done something to deserve it or that they are the real abuser in the relationship. And we're also seeing from our study that the police arrest men just as often as they arrest women, even when it is the man who calls the police because his wife is violent. Mm-hmm. So we have to continue to do this type of research like ours, and through continued coverage of this type of research and discussion of these results, we can hopefully begin to change these attitudes.
Now, you mentioned the hotline. It's my understanding that there's only one in the country that specializes on helping men with domestic violence. I think that's the Domestic Abuse Helpline for Men and Women. So mm-hmm. It's the only one that specializes with men, and it's not as if it's solely focused on men, since they do help women as well.
Right. They'll help anyone who calls them. But they do have a particular expertise in helping men, right. That's for sure. Yeah.
Well, Denise, I appreciate you joining me, and the study was certainly really interesting, and we'll be sure to put a link to that on within the article so people can read more about how post-traumatic stress disorder has been linked to male victims of domestic violence.
I want to thank you for calling me and having me on your show and being interested in this research. We're going to continue doing what we're doing so that we can get the word out there more about this issue.
Great. That was Denise Hines, Research Assistant Professor at Clark University, and you can read her study by clicking the link in the article that we will provide. That'll do it for this edition of Dad's Divorce Live. I'm Matt Allen, editor of DadsDivorce.com.